What's up, guys? So I wanted to make a quick video, as short as I can make it, discussing the Coyote cranks, especially dealing with blower setups. First and foremost, I wanted to talk about the stories about the cranks breaking on these cars, and specifically, a lot of people say that the Procharger kits are more prone, or basically the only ones that break cranks on these cars, and that's actually very far from the truth. Basically, every major setup out there uh, being sold for Coyotes have had some sort of crank issue, either by installation error or by abuse, hitting limiters, etc. Basically, all of them, even turbo setups, have had their crank issues. So it seems to be like the biggest issue with these cranks snouts are installation errors. A lot of people grab off the shelf dampener and put it on, and they either don't install it right, or they try to use the bolt to push the crank pulley in, and that's actually incorrect, and they end up believing that it's fully seated and torque it, and it's actually not. It's either too far out or crooked, and it ends up putting a lot of stress at high RPMs, and that ends up being the main issue for breaking the crank snout. Probably also assisted from trans brake setups and two-step setups, but I've had this setup for 5 years now, almost 4.5 years, and I haven't had any issues with belts. I had a really good installer put this setup together on this car. Always try to be conservative on the belt tension, which is also another reason why some of these cars break the snouts. You can potentially install the crank setup correctly, and you might still break the snout because people just go crazy with these belts. And as far as tension, and I wish you can kind of see that here, my belt isn't all that tight. I can move it. I can turn it almost 90 degrees. It's like there's no need for you to go crazy with this stuff, and it ends up causing failures. Always go conservative. Go to where it's tight. Test the car, and then if you feel like, based on logs, you still might have a little belt slip, go a hair tighter. You can also hit up people that you might know, or on the forums, ask them based on your pulley combination what belt you should use, and based on that belt, on these setups, you can see where the tensioner would be. On other setups like Vortex and Paxton's, they have holes on the brackets, I believe, where you can set it. I think it has 4 holes for tension, and if you know the pulley setup and you know the belt length and you know the hole to put it in, then you can't go wrong with installation. So those are the main reasons why I see a lot of people having errors. A lot of people that put together these cars in their garages, they think they know what they're doing, and they install something wrong, and it always seems to be the same thing. They go out, and in a week, the car doesn't even have 500 miles or 1,000 miles, and the crank snout flies off the damn thing, and they wonder why, or they blame the setup, or they post it online and 30 people blame the setup. But if anybody has proven that it isn't a Procharger specific setup, I like to think that this is the best example. Okay, not only have I had the car for 4.5 years on this setup, it makes good power, so you couldn't say that I'm very conservative and it makes very little power, so it doesn't really it won't really break it. It makes good power. It's got a lot of miles on the street. It's got 27,000 miles on the street over the 4.5 years. It's had maybe, I don't know, 70, 80 track passes, and according to logs, probably an extra 40 or 50 wide open throttle logs on the street. And on top of that, races and other just fun pools that I do on the street that I don't feel the need to be logged. And so when you put it all together, you're talking about 150 plus wide open throttle pools on this car, and I haven't had an issue. Does it mean that I will never have an issue? No. It could happen tomorrow, it could happen next week, but that doesn't mean that it's a setup. At this point, it's been on for a long time, and it's been raced, and if it happens, it doesn't really owe me anything. A lot of cars break them you know, within weeks of having it installed, this car has been beaten to death for 4.5 years and it still hasn't had an issue. And even if it happened next week or next month, I wouldn't blame the kit for it. I use you can also use a green belt, which is a little more forgiving. I use a black belt because I want the tensioner to do as little work as possible. The belt length is basically set, and once you set the tensioner, the system shouldn't really adjust much. On the green belts, when you put load on it, the green belt stretches, and then the tensioner has to do a lot of work to keep that tension in. So once I went over to the P1X, I chose to go with the black belt. I also use an ARP crank bolt, properly torqued, and like I said, I haven't had any issues with it. So next up, I want to go over what you get when you order one of these kits. Some vendors will sell you everything as a package. You can put it together through them, or you can buy it through Procharger and get the dampener on the side. So when you order this from Procharger, you get your bracket. It's either satin or, in this case, black. You get the spacers to mount it to the motor. You get the hardware, and you add the size pulley that you want. In this case, this is an 8-inch crank pulley, same as the system currently uses. It's just designed to work with the Innovators West dampener, which you see here. So this would drive the AC. This will drive the accessories, water pump, etc. And then this here will go in front. And this is what causes the most drama out online, that they say, well, look how far out this sits from the engine. And I don't disagree. I just don't think that if installed correctly and tensioned correctly, there should be any reason to, you know, think that you're gonna pull the snout off the thing, you know, 2 days later. But we've already talked about that. So that's basically what you get. I had been thinking for a while to get this. I ended up getting it on the used market. Somebody was parting out their vehicle, and I ended up getting it for a really good price. It also includes, which if you're going to go with one of these setups, I recommend it. This is I believe it's called the Kinetic Motorsports crank saver stud. It's threaded on both ends. It's got a nice big washer on it and a nut at the end to torque it. It's a really good setup. A lot of guys that I know with Procharger kits use these, but I'm sure you can use the ARP stud or the one that Procharger provides as well. This one just happened to come with this, and that's probably what I'll be using. Now I want to talk about the pros and cons / why I went with this setup. So cons, obviously you want to hear about the negatives. Negatives is that it's a fairly expensive setup. If you buy this brand new, it would probably cost you somewhere around 12 to 1300 bucks, I believe, in that neighborhood. Basically over $1,000 for this complete setup. You can either choose Innovators West or ATI dampener. They're both similar price, so it doesn't really change the overall cost of the kit. That's a con. It's expensive. Also, once you install this on the car, this will go down at the level of the crank. You cannot use your sway bar, front sway bar with this setup. It basically does not work. So you have to get rid of your front sway bar. So a lot of people like to, you know, carve corners with these cars. If you're gonna drag race, you don't really need a sway bar. The car drives fine. I don't have a sway bar on mine. I have a Steeda K member. The car drives fine. I have a good alignment, and I have nice street wheels, and it has bare brakes. So if anybody's tested the braking or cornering ability of this car, I probably have. Will I take it to a road course and race it around the road course? No. But for street driving, it serves its purpose, and it works great for the track. The next con for me is once you install this system, bracket system, onto the car, the belt does not really come out easy as it used to. So right now, when you loosen up this tensioner, this belt just kind of comes off the pulley, and you can just pull it off the crank pulley and it comes right out. No big deal. Put one other one in. You can probably swap a belt in 10 minutes. Once this system is installed, one of the brackets bolts onto this idler here, and down at the bottom of the engine as well. That just, it gets in the way. It's not an easy task anymore, but you know, just basically make sure that you put a good belt in when you install it, and it should last you, you know, depending on your use, a year. And then you have to remove the crank support and replace the belt. It's kind of a pain in the butt, but it is what it is. It comes with the territory. There's nothing you can do. Live with it. You chose to you know, deal with the potential of a crank snout issue, so what you have to deal with is you basically lose the ease of replacing belts on the setup. It is what it is. Nothing you can do about it. And lastly, I want to talk about the pro of the system and why I got it. So basically, I did it because at this point I'm making a good bit of power on the car. I'm hoping to go a little faster, which may require a potential pulley swap down, which will be spinning the blower near its max operating RPM. But the biggest thing is that I now have a two-step and a trans brake. And if you guys know how the two-step and trans brake works, is basically limiting timing at a set RPM, and it just rocks the engine back and forth to try to hold that RPM, and the trans brake holds the transmission as you wait for the green light to come on to launch the car. That in itself puts a lot of stress into the whole engine itself and the accessory system. I wanted to basically prevent a stupid error on my part or a roll the dice type of failure from taking out a motor that would otherwise be healthy. So with the average Joe that has a Procharger kit making 600 out of the wheels, need this crank support? No, I don't believe so. If you just enjoy the car on the street, you do the average pull in Mexico, you don't need this. If you're looking to push the car, especially the blower, high, you're looking to track it, you do a lot of racing, you're gonna be pushing the setup overall past what a Gen 2 motor would typically hold, right? You want to prevent something like that from taking out your whole motor. If you lose a ringland, well, so be it. You lost the ringland, nothing you can do. You were pushing the motor past the limits. You got to take it apart. But this way, I look at it no different than doing OPGs and crank sprocket. Just because you're going boost doesn't mean you need an OPG and a crank sprocket. If you're gonna be racing the car and beating on it, is it good safety margin? Is it good insurance? Yes. That's the same thing. That's the same way I look at this crank support. It's just something that you can put on and minimize the risk of something stupid from taking out your entire motor, entire investment, if you have a built motor, whatever the case might be. So being that I'm gonna be looking to potentially go very low nines, maybe if I get lucky we'll weather a high 8 on this setup in the future, I want to minimize the risk of something like that taking out my entire motor. So that's what I'm going to do. If the engine ends up failing from a ringland, a piston, a rod, well then so be it. Nothing I can do about that. But if I can minimize that, I'll do it. And the other pro was that, and why I'm doing it is because I got it at a really good price. So it's something that I couldn't pass up. It made a lot of sense to just do it now, since the racing months are kind of like slow now during the summer. So it was a good time to you know, purchase that because it came up, and put it on and basically prep the car for the winter time. I could have done it now at a fraction of the cost, or I could have done it in 3 or 4 months before the winter time and paid full price. Well, guess what? I'm no dummy. So if I can get something very cheap on the used market, I will. I bought it from somebody that I knew and I trusted, so I knew there wouldn't be any issue in that sense. So I went ahead and bought it from him. So look at that mod the same way you would do OPG and crank sprocket. Just because you make 700 to 750 wheel horsepower or 650 wheel horsepower doesn't mean you need an OPG and a crank sprocket. Well, it doesn't really mean that you need a crank support. If you beat the car, if you race the car, drag race the car, if you're gonna be stressing the motor to where you would think that Gen 2 can handle, right? Typically people say Gen 2 can hold 800 to 850 fairly well. Well, if you're gonna be at that or higher, well, guess what? You probably need an OPG and a crank sprocket. Well, if you're Procharged and you're gonna be pushing some of these blowers to their max, does it make sense to do something like that? I think it does. especially if you get it at a good price. Don't slip and let it slide, and then you gotta end up paying full price for it. But yeah, that's why I bought it. Those are the pros and cons. I don't really think that there's anything else I can add. If you guys have any questions in the comments, go ahead and drop them, and I'll answer them as I can. But yeah, all we're doing is just now prepping for the winter time and getting ready to hopefully make some quicker drag passes. Have a good day.